I was struggling a bit with the title of this, so I'm not quite sure if this reflects it. The future of work, but it's always a difficult thing to try to talk about. I'm one of those who believe in change and continuity, and the continuities are as important, and they influence the future. Whatever changes we'll see over the next number of years, I'd bet that women are still on average paid less than men. I can almost be certain about that. I bet you there'll still be segregation around class and race and other issues. So there's continuities that are going to continue to shape the experiences that people have at work. I think as well in the future we'll still be asking, what does work give us? That question's been asked for, I don't know, hundreds of years, possibly, since industrialization. What does work give us? There's lots of negative answers we can give. I want to give some positive ones as well. Work can give us pride, personal fulfillment, enhancement of skills and knowledge. It can give us a lot of important social relationships. It can give us friendships that last an eternity. So there's lots of positive things that work can give us. It can also be a source for dignity. And that's the story I'm going to try and encapsulate over the next few minutes. Now, I'm going to try and link this into a study that myself and some colleagues did a couple of years ago. And the sense of dignity, it reminds me of somebody I interviewed, a woman called Frances, who was a marketing manager in a heritage organization. Frances was a real go-getter. She would say things in interview like, my identity is completely inseparable from my work. She was completely bought into her work. She was, one of these, as Martina was talking about how we might face work in the future, she was one of those where she had, her work-life balance was, work is my life. And she adored her work and everything. But by the time I interviewed her, she was one of what would eventually be 11 million UK workers who were furloughed during the pandemic. 11 million workers. 400 billion pounds, whatever it was. 400 billion was across the pandemic. The furlough scheme was about 70 billion pounds, thereabout, during the sort of April 2020 to September 2021 period that it was in existence. So Frances was one of a number of furloughed workers that we interviewed as we were interested in whether furlough would be a threat to their dignity and how they saw themselves as workers, and how this sudden stoppage of work affected them. We were literally talking about people who were given a few days' notice and told, don't come back into the workplace. You cannot work for your employer. There's a cessation of your work. Oddly, you could work for a separate employer, but you couldn't work for your current employer until July 2020 when they changed and made the furlough scheme a bit more flexible. I don't know why I've got these notes, because I can't actually read them, because I don't have my reading glasses on. So I'd have to hold them like this. But let me just... So me and a couple of colleagues, one from Northumbria University, one from Sheffield University, we did a series of longitudinal interviews with furloughed workers from a number of different organizations. The pictures there indicate some of the organizations that the interviewees worked in. Zoom was a wonderful thing at this point because you could interview people from Aberdeen to Aberystwyth without having to travel. So Zoom was actually a bit of a boon for doing interview-based research. The majority of our interviewees were from the heritage sector, principally various museums like the British Museum, Science Museum, and such like. But we also had some interviewees from the hospitality sector and the retail sector. They were quite different because the hospitality sector just closed and then it reopened. The heritage sector, it was a much more differentiated and variegated experience because some of them closed and then could open because they had big spaces like the British Museum, but there was lots of organizations within the National Trust, for example, which closed almost for, in Sudbury Hall, closed for well over a year because the spaces in the building couldn't accommodate social distancing. So there was major changes in many of the National Trust organisations during this point. So we were interested in the challenges that the furloughed workers faced during this period. So we were interested in dignity. Now, dignity is a pretty elusive concept. This isn't Frances, but it could have been Frances when she was still working in her organisation. Dignity is an elusive concept. It features in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but it also, we know, features organisationally, and things like harassment and managerial abuse and other things can create serious threats to our sense of dignity. What it is, there's lots of different definitions, there's lots of different terms that can be associated with, as we see there, things like self-worth, how you're treated, self-esteem, whether you're given a voice, etc. There's a short definition there about it being the state of being worthy. But what it also is, it can be self-induced. You can get dignity through the work that you do. The craftsperson who builds a wonderful table can get dignity through the sense of accomplishment and the pride in their work. But it's also a social phenomenon in terms of an interactional thing around the people you work with, whether these are colleagues, managers, customers, clients, even students. I was meant to create a ripple of laughter, but obviously not. So yeah, as I keep saying, we're interested in how dignity worked here. Now there's several studies now. We're at a point where many studies have come out from work done during the pandemic and comparisons between furloughed and non-furloughed staff. There's been several studies that have shown the distress, the stress that furloughed workers were experiencing compared to non-furloughed workers. And many of these studies, even at least at the level of inference, indicate that things like self-worth and self-esteem were features in terms of how furloughed workers navigated their way through this experience. The mental health of furloughed workers tended to be more seriously affected through the pandemic than non-furloughed workers. The Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development brought out some reports, and amongst other things, they talked about how furloughed workers could feel a sense of being dispensable, especially in those organisations like the heritage ones we looked at, where there was some workers working from home and some who were furloughed. And this is where people like Frances felt dignity threats, because they were one of the chosen ones, i.e. to be furloughed. So there was interesting dynamics around the way in which dignity played through this period. So in terms of what we were finding between furloughed workers and how they experienced things, just to give a few quotations, and I will have to move my glasses down so I can read my quotes. One clear threat was job security. As you can imagine, there was, suddenly people are being told you can't come into work, so there's economic crisis impending. They're going to be fearful about their jobs. 15% of the people we interviewed lost their jobs. That's a high number. I mean, in absolute terms, it wasn't a huge number, but 15% is a large relative number of people who were made redundant. The National Trust, the Sudbury Hall and other places, there was one trust location that employed 49 people. 36 of them were made redundant because it couldn't reopen because of social distancing and such like. So job security was a major threat to redundancy. There was also a sense of diminished self-worth. One of the interviewees, Judith, quote, she said, furlough was a huge existential crisis. It left her feeling quite worthless. The major threat to dignity, however, was the actions of senior management. The actions of senior management was what almost every single one of our interviewees saw as the thing that really made them feel worthless. And what it came through was the communication. There was initially the sense of who was chosen for furlough And there was very few senior management in the organisations we looked at who were chosen for furlough. Now, don't forget, the furlough scheme had an income cap of £2,500 a month. One of our interviewees, what did she say? She said, Fiona expressed her anger. Quote, you know, the rhetoric is all about organisation unity, about treating everyone fairly, but really the people it matters for are the people on 6 figures. So they were allowed to homework and they kept their full salary. Those who were furloughed lost 20% of their salary, and of course they were paid on average far, far less than the senior management. The thing that really seemed to create a sense of marginalisation was the senior management's organisational communication. There was one chief executive who one of the interviewees said, she basically came in with a sheet of paper with a list of jobs, and at each job it said non-essential. And she handed this out to the people in the room. Now, does that sound a good management practice? How the heck does somebody become a chief executive if they can do something like that? At a point in time when people are extremely fearful, where there's a multitude of uncertainties that people are experiencing during this, what might be called an event time phenomenon. And you hand out a piece of paper saying, your job's non-essential. This created a sense of marginalisation within those who were furloughed. Now, there was that at the beginning of furlough, but even as furlough was continuing and the organisational communication was, reaching out to people and trying to keep them engaged, the form and the focus of the organisational communication during that time as well by the interviewees was that the furloughed workers had ceased to exist. As Diane said it, there's literally nothing in the communication that pertains to us. Liz put it, the people on furlough might as well not exist. There's nothing spoken about them. So they're non-essential, and now they're non-existent in the organisational discourse that's circulating around the organisation. The marginalisation that the furloughed workers felt was both a physical, a social, and an emotional one. Physical in the sense that they're outside of the building, social in that they're not able to interact with colleagues, and then emotional about what's the future got for me and so on. Now, I'm realising that time has probably gone on, so I need to move. Where are we going with this? I think we did a longitudinal study, but we also were in contact late last year, early this year with them. We're still in contact with some of the furloughed workers. Most of them now work in a hybrid mode. So there has been significant change. A number of them were made redundant. They have other jobs. What's interesting is how they conceive of the future, is how the past treated them. There was a present at a point in time. There's always a present, but it quickly becomes the past. And they were in a present which was about furlough, which was about all the different things that they experienced, all the uncertainties, etc. There was mixed views about furlough. There was some who loved it. They got lots of time to do things. It didn't mean there wasn't uncertainties about their future and their job and other such things, but they sort of navigated their way through it in a way that met their needs. But there's no doubt that the past created a future for them. They started seeing how the organizational communication and the experience that centered around them, the marginalization, etc., that they felt, was something that they wanted to resist for the future. They wanted to make sure, in a sense, some of the points Martina was making, they wanted to make sure that in the future they weren't going to be experiencing this kind of organizational communication where they were marginalized and invisible or non-existent and such like. Now, what does the furlough and this kind of research tell us about the future? We didn't do the research in order to think about the future. I'm just doing that because Olga asked me to. Honesty is always the best policy when it comes to this. Much of what we talk about in the future of work is about how digitalization is going to drive things, or how artificial intelligence is going to mean whatever it is about things, ecological sustainability. It's not how most people conceive of their working lives. Most people conceive of their working lives on a week-to-week basis about, am I going to have enough to pay the mortgage that's, the interest rates have gone up again, or my rent has gone up, or whatever it is. Across the planet, we're meant to take an international perspective, and across the planet, there's still a vast number of people who are working for less than $2 a day and so on. We're the privileged, sitting in this Radisson hotel, or standing in my case. We're lucky. Maybe we deserve our luck. Maybe we worked for our luck, but we're still lucky. American wages have stagnated since the 1970s. The future isn't that they're going to suddenly be enhanced and move on. British workers' wages have stagnated since 2005. French workers get criticized because they want to protect their retirement age and their pension. That's what's going to be the future as well. The future isn't just going to be AI and us considering how we create value for the future. The future is still going to be French workers wanting to protect their retirement age and their pensions. And I bet you all of us want to protect our retirement age and our pensions, even at the same time as we say, these French workers retiring at 61. Heck, I wish. Who wants to retire at 67 or 68 or 69, or the younger ones in here, 75, I bet you. So the future will still be the tensions of the past, and the past will be influencing how the future will work through. There will be continuing conflict and tension, but there will also be people who have wonderful work experiences and have great colleagues, good bosses, etc., etc. I think we need to be non-misty-eyed about the future. We need to recognize that the past is always there, it's always coming through, and it's always shaping how things are going to be. There's another point about the future as well. When Ford's production line came into existence, that was a massive revolutionary thing. It drove the American economy. The 20th century was the American century, and it was driven, amongst other things, through the automobile industry. We can keep on having event times in terms of how work has been hugely challenged and influenced, whether it's the rise of the PC, whether it's the internet, whether it's going to be artificial intelligence. There'll always be something, but there'll always be continuities as well. Women will still continue to be paid less than men on average. Depending on the color of your skin, your labor market chances are going to be poorer, depending on your sexuality, etc., etc. So we need to accommodate both of these aspects into it. All the challenges around the fancy things that we all sometimes can't get our heads around, but all these ongoing things that are about human conflict and human tension and such like. So, what happened to Frances? Frances left her work. She left her job. She quit her job. She's now in a different organization. And when she emailed me a couple of months ago, she wrote, I shouldn't probably quote this because it's a private email, but I'm going to anyway. She wrote, "Furlough was such an intense period, but it proved to be a pivotal moment in my life. I've just had a promotion in my new organization, and I'm enjoying a new challenge." I like that because I think Frances has restored her dignity, both through her work and, it sounds, through the interactions that she's got in her organization. So I'll finish on that happy mood and happy mode. Okay.